Well, it's good to be with you all tonight. And tonight is a particular pleasure for me. Back in 1992, I moved across the country from southern Alberta to Ontario, and I was getting ready to study politics. And at that time in my life, politics was more of a game to compete in than it was something to reflect upon. And I enjoyed playing that game. And tonight's guest, uh, I would say that he, in some respects, ruined the game for me. But at the same time, he also saved me from not necessarily delving into a way of thinking about politics that is unhealthy. And I'm very grateful for the fact that I was able to study under Dr. David Koyzis and do a political science degree with him. And so Dr. Koyzis was teaching at Redeemer University at that time, and he taught there for over 30 years. He is the author of this book, Political Visions and Illusions, and that will be a part of our conversation tonight. But Dr. Koyzis, we are thankful that you could join us this evening. Welcome.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Now, we won't get into what kind of a student I was back in 1992, although I do recall from my undergraduate that there were far too many 8 a.m. classes, which may not have been a good reflection for me, as I was rather social in those days. But I do want to get into beginning to talk a little bit about your journey and consider how it is that you came to be involved in politics or study political science. And how did this become a passion for you?
Well, it was a rather gradual process. I grew up in a very politically minded family. My father was born in the Greek Orthodox community in Cyprus, the island in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. It's about 80% Greek speaking, at least up until maybe 45 years ago, about 20% Turkish Muslim. And it was very much a mixed island in that respect. So I grew up in a very politically minded family. We were always talking about politics. I remember the first political memory I have was the election campaign. I was born in the United States near Chicago. The election campaign between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon in 1960. Not many children would have clear political memories about something that happened when they were 5 years old, but that was I recognized that there was a lot at stake in that particular election. Of course, 3 years later, a very traumatic memory of mine was the assassination of John Kennedy on the 22nd of November of 1963, a Friday. I can even tell you what day of the week it was, and I was in grade 3 at the time. So a number of for me, when I was growing up, I had interests that were all over the map. I was interested in art. I was interested in music. I was interested in the stage plays. I was interested in foreign languages, and a whole lot of different things. When I started university, I had thought I was going to major in music. But as it happened, in 1974, that was when Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency. It was the culmination of the Watergate scandal that virtually paralyzed the United States for about maybe about a year and a half. And then that same summer of 1974, the island of Cyprus was invaded, and all of my relatives on my dad's side became refugees because they lived in the northern part of Cyprus, which was then occupied by Turkey at that point. So those two events coinciding helped to move me in the direction of a focused study of political science, and that's what I followed then through undergraduate education and through graduate school as well.
And as you got into, you began teaching at Redeemer University. Was that your first primary teaching position, or were you elsewhere before that?
No, that was my first. I had taught. I was a graduate assistant at University of Notre Dame in Indiana, United States, and I was teaching. I think there were 4 courses there. They were what are they called? They were first-year seminar courses, writing courses, basically for the first-year students, and that was during my final year at Notre Dame, just before I came to Canada.
And when I was studying with you, we used a number of different books to get at the core of various political ideologies. But somewhere along the way, in 2003, I believe, you published your book, Political Visions and Illusions. And I have found that to be a very helpful book and a very good summary. But I was wondering if maybe you could just summarize, why did you write this book? And if you could possibly cover off on what are the main basic tenets of this book that would be helpful for giving everybody here a bit of an idea of what this book is about.
Yeah. And in 1992, that was before I even started writing Political Visions and Illusions. About 5 years earlier, I was given a particular course to teach, and it was called something like Modern Political Ideologies. And back then there was no internet, so you had to go through these orange volumes of books in print, and you'd have to actually write to these people. Maybe you would phone them perhaps, and they would send you these examination copies of their textbooks. And of course, maybe, I don't know if that's now considered obsolete now, because everything is online. You can view tables of contents and maybe a sample chapter online and get a sense of what what kind of books to order. For me, as I was looking through books, I couldn't find a textbook that did what I thought needed to be done in such a course on modern political ideologies. So I can't even tell you what book I might have been using in 1992. I may have changed perhaps every year. And then, I used the book for students. They would read it, and then I would pretty much do my own thing around that. 2 years later, in 1994, I started writing the book. And I came up with 5 chapters fairly quickly during that summer. I think I ended up scrapping probably 3 of them. And it took me up until 2001 to finish the book. And then that's when it was published then by InterVarsity Press 2 years later. And the thesis of the book in its original first edition was that the political ideologies are inescapably religious in character. They take something out of the creation and they elevate it to the position of God. Doesn't mean that the thing that they elevate is bad in itself. Usually the political ideologies have focused on something that's genuine, something that's true, but they make too much of that one thing. The second edition follows through on that, but in the second edition I focus on what might be called the redemptive narratives, or the salvation stories that underpin the various ideologies. So I have a few more visual, a few more figures that I put into the book to demonstrate how this works. And yeah, so that's basically what I do in Political Visions and Illusions.
Now,
I can get into more detail if you want.
Yeah, I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit about what you see are the 5 basic ideologies that you cover, and then maybe you critique them from a Christian perspective and begin to speak about how there's a certain amount of idolatry in each of them. And maybe I think it'd be helpful if you could explain what the 5 are and how you see what you see as idolatrous in each of them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the five ideologies that I deal with are liberalism in this order, taken in this order in the book by the chapters. Liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, democratism, and democratism is a word that I don't use in the first edition, but I decided to put it into the second edition, and then finally socialism. And those are the 5 biggies. I don't deal with anarchism. I may mention it in passing, perhaps. Syndicalism, and various kinds of side ideologies, as it were. But I think liberalism, the one big truth that it has is the emphasis on individual liberty, individual freedom. Of course, there are different ways of defining freedom, of putting limits on freedom, but that's the big thing. So everything is individual freedom. For conservatism, it's basically, I don't really find a redemptive narrative, a salvation story in conservatism as such, but basically it revolves around tradition. The thing that unites conservatives, whatever their stripe, wherever they are, whatever time or place we're talking about, is this love of tradition. And of course, traditions can be an exceedingly mixed bag. Racial segregation in the American South prior to the 1960s was a tradition, but it's one that we're better off without. But on the other hand, we could hardly do without tradition because we are more like our parents, for example, than we are unlike them. We've inherited a whole series of traditions. So that's the moment of truth that we find in conservatism. Nationalism, communal solidarity of some sort on the part of people who have shared shared language, shared ethnicity, if you will, shared citizenship. That itself is a very good thing, but of course it's possible to make too much of a nation, and it ends up becoming oppressive of individuals, of minority groups, and the like. Democratism. Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, once said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And somebody like Churchill would not have redemptive expectations of something like democracy. It's not going to bring a perfect society. It's not going to result in perfect justice. It's a good form of government, but it's possible to make too much of it, as if that's the goal of all human striving. And that's when democracy, the love of democracy, becomes democratism, an ideology, if you will. And then finally, we have socialism, and socialism is certainly right to be concerned for the disadvantaged, for the poor, for people who have lost out in the market economy. Those are all very good things. Class solidarity is something that socialism in its various forms has preached. But again, it's possible to make too much of that. It's possible that an economic class can be seen to take priority over every other legitimate consideration. And that's when we get into socialism. And those are the big fives, the big five.
Now, you label these as all being somewhat idolatrous. How does someone then involve themselves in the political life of
Yeah.
their nation and not feel like they're falling into idolatry no matter which direction they choose?
Yeah, right. No, that's a good question, and it's one that I've pondered myself, because people who are going to get involved in political life have to choose their co-belligerents. They have to join themselves up with a political grouping, maybe a political party of some sort. So inevitably, you have to join forces with people whom you might not necessarily agree with on every possible point. By the use of idolatry, however, I need to emphasize that if when I talk about idolatry, I'm not just pointing the finger to out there, oh, you're an idolater, And, no, as a matter of fact, what we really need to do is to look inside ourselves, because the worship of idols, idolatry, is something that we find in our own hearts. We ourselves. We ourselves are our own worst enemy. What is it? There was this cartoon in the comic papers when I was growing up called Pogo, and one of the things that Pogo said, Walt Kelly was the artist who created Pogo, and he said, we have met the enemy, and it is us. We are our own worst enemies. So it's not to point fingers at other people. It's not to say that we can separate ourselves out from all of the erroneous ways of thinking or viewing life or living our lives, but we have to look deep into ourselves to begin with. And as for getting involved, we have to choose. We may have to choose a particular political party if we want to influence policy from without. Then it's possible to join a lobby group or maybe an interest group of some sort. If we want to be involved ourselves in the policy process, then that means that we'll have to probably join a political party. But as we do so, we should recognize that it's far from perfect. And we may work to try to enhance the the genuine insights of that political party, the advantages of the political party, while working to diminish what may be considerable flaws of the party as well.
Well, but I mean, that leads me to thinking about what I see as a high level of cynicism amongst many people for getting involved in politics. Where there is the sense that, well, all of politics is corrupt. Why would I want to get involved? But it also has that undercurrent of not having a respect of any kind of authority. And I mean, you've done some writing on that too. So I wonder if you might be able to just say a little bit about that as well. Like, what does it mean to get involved without necessarily falling prey to cynicism, and how do we develop a sense of authority, a respect for authority within the current state of politics?
Right, yeah. Not easy to do, and there have been times that I've been cynical about political life as well. Mostly when I was younger, I also found myself getting angry as well because of what was happening in political life. Richard Nixon, back in the 1970s, I was furious when Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon's successor in the presidency, pardoned his predecessor, Richard Nixon, from from punishment for any crimes that he had committed. But when I got older, there are things that still bother me, to be sure, but there's also a recognition that that we will never have perfect politics. We have to do what we can within the places that God has placed us, and it's not particularly easy not to be taken in by the erroneous ways of viewing life and trying to do politics. In amongst all of the efforts for justice, there are also going to be people who will, or political parties, inadvertently commit injustices as well. So, even to talk about justice, each of these ideologies has its own view of justice. And the idea, if somebody, if I tell you, well, I want to see justice done, you have every right to ask me what the content of justice is as I see it. And depending on who's involved in political life, a member of the New Democratic Party is going to tell you that justice means such and such. A member of the Liberal Party of Canada will tell you that justice means this. A member of the Conservative Party will give you a notion of justice as well. Same with the Greens and minor parties as well. So yes.
So how would you define justice then, in terms of what it would look like for a deeper biblical sense of justice?
I will give you the very basic definition of justice that we find in Plato's Republic. And oftentimes discussions of justice go back 2,500 years to the time of the ancient Greeks, because that's when you first have this, in-depth theoretical reflection on the nature of justice. And justice is basically rendering to each his due, or giving to people what they deserve. But not only people, but even the things around us, the world. What do we owe to the physical environment, for example? What does it mean to have justice for our environment, justice for minority groups, justice for business, small business people, justice for corporate entities of various sorts, justice for families, justice for marriages, and so forth. And those are all things that we have to work out very carefully. Now, we do have certain groups of people that call themselves SJWs, social justice warriors. And on the one hand, I want to applaud them for being concerned for justice and being concerned to see that justice is done. On the other hand, I would want to throw up a big caution and say, if you think you know what justice is, if you are rushing to judgment in your understanding of justice, you may need to stand back. You may need to pull back and think about what exactly does justice mean, not only in particular contexts, where the rubber meets the road, but also in this profound in-depth sense that what is justice? What is justice in what does it mean to be just within the context of a marriage? It means to be faithful to one's spouse at the very least. What does it mean to be just within the context of a university? For example, it means to, if you're a professor, you need to treat your students fairly in marking their work. If you're a student, you need to treat the instructor fairly as well. But then when we get to political life, there's a special kind of justice that we might call public justice, because it has to do with doing justice to the variety of individuals and communities that we find in an ordinary differentiated society, such as what we find in Canada and the United States and other Western countries as well.
Okay, but how do you weigh through that? Because I hear what you're saying and understand the critique of social justice warriors, but yet there's also the opposite critique that some people say, yeah, but we can contemplate what is justice till the cows come home, but if we don't actually sometimes do something, then change will never take place where change needs to take place.
That's right.
And so I guess the question for me then is how do you go about weighing what causes are worth pursuing? And
that's right.
Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, that's right. And there are different causes. There are causes on opposite sides of issues. Those are the things we need to attend to. So once again, people will have different conceptions of what justice is. But for me, when I think of justice, I see something that Paul Marshall has defined as the interrelation of justly interrelating various communities and individuals within a society. So if you're a consistent liberal, an individualist, a liberal individualist, you're going to say, well, the individual must always win out when it comes to a conflict between the individual and the community. Well, that's a possibility, but if you're not a liberal, then you're more likely to say, let's weigh this in the balance. Every community has its own standards that it's supposed to that it attempts to maintain. Every community is like that. There's no such thing as a community that's boundlessly inclusive. And of course, inclusivity is a word that's used a lot these days as a kind of virtue. The more inclusive a community is, then presumably the better it is. But you can't have a community that's made up of all of humanity. If we're talking about a family, I have a responsibility to my wife and my daughter that outweighs my responsibility to other people, even living in Hamilton, even to friends and other relatives. And that's simply by the nature of a family as a family. I have a duty to love my wife more than I love other women. And again, that's in the nature of a marriage, that I'm supposed to love my wife and to be faithful to her, and not to mess around with other women. So communities, they're not just fictitious creations of willful individuals, but we are embedded in communities from the very beginning. I was born a citizen of a state. I was born a citizen of the United States. I took out Canadian citizenship much later, about maybe a quarter of a century ago. I was born to a particular birth family. My father died 2 months ago at the age of 92, and up until that, I talked to him as often as I could. And now that my dad has passed on, I talk with my mother. I try to talk with her every day, because that's my duty as a son. I did not choose my birth family. This was an obligation that was given to me at birth. And I would venture to say that there are very many other obligations that cannot simply be reduced to voluntary consent. And that's something that liberalism is not really capable, at least a consistent liberalism is not capable of accounting for easily.
Now, as you talk about liberalism, you're talking about a more classical understanding of liberalism then, as opposed to being a Liberal Party member in the current context of Canada.
Yeah, there is a distinction between the two, yes.
And in your
Yeah.
writings, you're often making the argument that what you see going on in much of contemporary politics is that they are, in fact, all somewhat liberal in terms of the way they approach society.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's the liberalism is not restricted to the Liberal Party of Canada or any of its provincial counterparts. The Conservative Party of Canada is basically a kind of liberal party, and has become more so since the union of the old the Reform Party, which became the Canadian Alliance in the year 2000. A few years later, it merged with what was left of the Progressive Conservative Party to become the Liberal Party of Canada. And I venture to say, since that merger, the Conservative Party has become more liberal. The New Democratic Party, even though it adheres to the principles of socialism, is in large measure it too has a great deal of liberal individualism in its general ethos. I think that's true with the American parties. The Democrats and the Republicans they simply take two different sides of the liberal tradition and try to carry it. Right now, they're taking them to extremes. But yeah, liberalism it's very much characteristic of political life here in the English-speaking world, especially the United States and Canada.
So how do we as Christians not fall prey to a classical form of liberalism, whereby we're placing the individual as somewhat the center of the conversation? How do we bring a maybe a more balanced voice?
Yeah. Well, I think there are no catchy slogans that we can throw at the public or at government. It's not "Workers of the World Unite" is the slogan of the Marxists. "Bread and freedom," that was something that was used by Russian revolutionaries prior to even in the 1905 revolution in Russia. And there's no real catchy slogan that we can throw at the media. Come up with a catchy meme to put on our Facebook profiles or what have you. But I think it's just recognizing that our society is very diverse, and by diversity I mean that there is a variety of communities in which we are embedded. Some of these are indeed voluntary associations. So you can join a chess club if you want. You can play chess till you're blue in the face, and then once you get tired of chess, you decide you want to join an anglers association and then to go fishing, and you can leave the chess club and join the anglers association. Or else it may be that all of the people that like to play chess suddenly decide, well, we're going to become a hunting society instead, and we're going to wait until hunting season. We're going to buy rifles and we'll take them out, and you can do that if you'd like. But an ordinary society is made up of schools. It's made up of museums. It's made up of labor unions, of business enterprises. It's made up of a wide variety of communities, each of which has its own task to fulfill, a normative task, if you will, within an ordinary human society. And again, you can't take that, you can't make a catchy slogan out of that. But when it comes to the possibility of conflict amongst different kinds of communities, or maybe even different manifestations of the same kind of community, then it may be that government officials will have to step in some way and try to adjudicate that dispute in a very careful way. So to listen to both sides, not to rush to judgment and say, oh, well, the justice requires that I do this, and this, when as a matter of fact, it may be that you're biased in favor of one group against another from the very outset. And if that's the case, then you're not going to be willing to listen to people, to sit down and listen to both sides and to make a judgment. And of course, nowadays it seems as though people too quickly go to the barricades, in which they're simply yelling at each other across the barricades rather than sitting down and listening to each other. And listening is a skill. That's a political skill, and it needs to be cultivated. Not simply talking. We have parliament, and parliament comes from the French word parler, which means to talk. But maybe we need something, a counterpart, another way of describing our parliament in which people are actually listening to each other as well. And if we're listening to each other, it means that we're taking each other seriously. It means that we're not dismissing them out of hand as being unjust or evil or the devil or what have you, but we're listening to people, hearing their concerns, and making wise decisions on the basis of that.
So what role does the church have in this conversation then, or does it? Is the church confined to its sphere, or is the church actually able to have a voice that speaks into some of these other spheres of life? Because if we truly believe that God is Lord over all, then on some respects there's a piece in which the sphere of the church is not just a society that we choose to be a part of. It's not like the chess club, then, is it? In some respects, it is a voice that speaks into the chess club, but it also could speak into the Anglers Club, but it speaks into Parliament and so on and so on, is it not?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And we need to make a distinction between two ways that we use the term church. This is a distinction that was made by Abraham Kuyper, the Dutch Christian statesman, 1837 up until 1920. This is the centenary of his death this year. And he made a distinction between the church as a particular institution, and then the church as the body of Christ, or to use a fancy Latin word, the Corpus Christi, the body of Christ. And as the body of Christ, the church is manifest in every area of life, and that includes family life, it includes marriage, it includes education, it includes labor unions, it includes business, workplace, and also politics, economics, and so forth. But then we also have the church as a particular institution, a differentiated institution. And when people talk about the relationship between church and state, well, it's church in this very focused institutional sense that they have in mind. We can sometimes call it the gathered church as well, the church that meets to worship God. It's the church that preaches the word, that gathers to hear the word preached from the pulpit, to administer and to receive the sacraments, to build each other, up so that we will live the Christian life to the glory of God. And in that respect, then we have to be very careful when we talk about the church as an institution and political life. Now, the first edition of Political Visions and Illusions I wrote with the church as the body of Christ in mind. But then I found out that my book was actually used in theological seminaries in both Canada and the United States, and some people who had taught at seminaries or had been educated at seminaries thought that I should address the issue of the institutional church and how it should relate to political life. When I was growing up, my childhood pastor would regularly preach on political matters in a way that alienated members of the congregation, and there are ways to touch on political life, and there are ways not to touch political life from the pulpit or from an ecclesiastical assembly of some sort. In the second edition of Political Visions and Illusions, I've appended a postscript. I call it a concluding ecclesiological postscript, and here I quite explicitly address the role of the institutional church with respect to political life. I don't believe that a church assembly ought to pronounce on say the $15 per hour minimum wage, or, for example, a two-state solution for the Israel-Palestine controversy in the Middle East. But I do believe that from the pulpit, ministers should preach about justice and about the need to do justice. And it's a tough balance to walk. I don't think they should be pronouncing on particular political issues, but I think that as part of the formation, the spiritual formation of the parishioners, that justice ought to be dealt with from the pulpit. We can't just simply spiritualize it and say, no, this is something that belongs to the world. We're just going to preach about it. We're going to talk about prayer. We're going to talk about the sacraments and the Bible, and that's basically it. Because the gospel, the message of the gospel, touches the whole of life. And that's something that ministers of the gospel, and indeed elders, church officials, bishops, if depending on which denomination you're part of, ecclesiastical assemblies, need to deal with in some fashion.
So I'll just ask one more question before I open up to the students to ask questions that they might have.
Okay.
I guess the question that I'd want to go to right now is, you personally as a Christian,
Yeah.
what are your greatest political concerns right now?
Well, as a Christian, I don't know that you necessarily have to be a Christian to share this concern, but my concern right now is that politics has become it's become a matter in which people are now likely to shout at each other across barricades rather than to sit down and listen. Now, I think the polarization is more acute south of the border. I think we're seeing that between Trump and Biden. If you watched the first debate, it was a bit of a mess. I don't think anybody believed that it followed traditional debating norms. It was a bit of a chaotic. More like maybe a wrestling match or a roller derby, perhaps, rather than an actual debate. And my fear, particularly for the country south of the border, is that people are not so much concerned with maintaining the constitutional the institutions of the Constitution, taken in the broad sense. I don't necessarily mean the document that's called the Constitution of the United States, but a constitution in the sense of the whole political system and the way that it functions. And there's not enough concern for the smooth functioning of the system as a whole, as much as trying to advance a particular partisan agenda. And that is very much concerning to me. I think we're less moving in that direction here in Canada, but very often what I've seen over the decades is that when the United States follows in a particular path, we are not very far behind. So I do have concerns about this country as well.
Okay, I want to open it up to students and any questions you might have in particular for Dr. Koyzis. You can ask a question by posting something in the chat box, or you may certainly unmute yourself to ask the question. It's not that many of us here in total, so it's I'll do my best to keep my eye open for anybody that's putting their hand up. My bandwidth is low, so I can't always see everybody quickly. A question that comes in the chat box. So you think churches should teach on values that amount to justice, but not align themselves to specific solutions?
Church institutions, yes, because the judgment as to how we apply the principles of justice to particular situations are going to vary. They're really more prudential concerns. So it's possible that Sid and I might be agreed on basic principles of justice, but when it comes to a particular policy issue, for example, the minimum wage, what is a fair minimum wage? We might come up with different dollar figures. And so I think the churches from the pulpit should be preaching on the basis of what's actually in the Bible. At the very beginning, Sid, I don't know if you would remember this, but this is something that I was doing from the very beginning, is taking my students through various passages, especially those in the Old Testament, in which God's people are commanded to do justice, especially to three groups that were singled out as being particularly needful of just treatment. And these were the widows, the fatherless, the orphans, and the sojourners, those people who were not part of the land tenure system within the ancient within ancient Israel. And those are the sorts of things that need to be preached from the pulpit. We can't. I don't think we, in any way, should preachers simply say, well, as parishioners, you're on your own. You have to decide what justice is and what it calls for. I think the basic principles need to be given to parishioners, based on what the Bible actually teaches. But if it's a matter of deciding what is the proper dollar amount for a minimum wage, then we're going to have differences of opinion, legitimate differences of opinion. It might vary from one place to the next. The cost of living is higher in Toronto and Vancouver than it would be in, say, Kenora or Saskatoon. So these are the sorts of things that I think we need to keep in mind as the church as an institution is trying to form people, to shape people to be people of justice, servants of God and of our neighbors.
Next question.
Hey, David. Sorry, I can't figure out how to put my hand up. Is it cool if I just talk?
Okay.
I hear from you. Oh, first of all, I just want to say I appreciate everything you had to say about justice.
Oh, thank you.
I also like to think about justice. And one of the things I struggle with right now is in a political system that seems to either have a distorted view of justice or a lack of concern for justice.
Right.
How do we effectively be active citizens in our country?
Okay, say that again. Could you express that in maybe a little bit different words?
I can try to.
Okay.
At least it seems to me that our current political system in Canada, or the parties that represent us at any rate, don't have a very strong regard for justice, or at least, I don't know how to put it. It seems to be that the justice I would like to see isn't taking place.
Yeah.
So how do we as citizens pursue justice well in this system?
Right. Well, I think you have to remember that justice is not a kind of it's not an entity that's either absent or present. It's not, you say, well, justice is completely absent, and I want to make sure that justice is here, so I'm going to try to bring it down. It's not a kind of Platonic form that we have to kind of reach up into the heavens and to try to bring it down to our present life in the world. So, every political party, whether it's the Liberals or the Conservatives or the New Democrats, the Greens, or what have you, is inevitably doing justice in some fashion, because it's engaged in the process of weighing in the balance, weighing various interests in the balance. Now, what you're telling me now is that you may not like the balance that the different parties have come to. Okay, and that's fair enough, but what that means is that, it's not a matter of saying that justice is absent, but recognizing that there's a very large measure of justice that's being done. I'm quite happy living here in Canada. I think this is a great country. I love this country. In some ways, I think I prefer to be here now than in my home country of the United States, for reasons that I don't need to get into, but you might be able to use your imagination to figure out. But in large measure, justice is being done. And it's when justice is not being done, that's when we're going to read about it in the news, and that's when we are concerned, when we rightly become concerned about that, and then we try to work as well as we can, whether it's internally through an existing political party, whether it's through a lobby group. Then we can become involved, not to try to bring about justice, to create a just society, but to try to gently guide the processes of justice which are already in place, to try to move them away from miscarrying justice towards a better understanding of justice. So I think that's really what we're trying to do.
Thank you.
If I'm hearing you correct on that one, David, would you say that at times, as citizens, we have become too critical of governments with respect to how they carry out justice, and we fail to sometimes see the very good that's right in front of us?
I think so. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's yeah. There are some people that say, well, an all or nothing approach. Well, I'll go back about 30 years. This was after the Supreme Court of Canada had struck down Section 251 of the Canadian Criminal Code that had to do with abortion. This was the law that had been enacted in 1969. It was when Pierre Trudeau was Justice Minister under Lester Pearson, and then he became Prime Minister. It was the court struck it down based on certain sections of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but it left a wide leeway for Parliament to enact another abortion law that would regulate it in a way that was minimally tolerable to as many people as possible. There were certain pro-life activists that say this doesn't go far enough. We're going to oppose this. And what ended up happening is that there's no law whatsoever, because it ended Brian Mulroney's law to try to answer the Supreme Court and to enact another law ended up failing on a I'm tempted to say a freak vote against it in the Senate. Generally, the Senate goes along with the House of Commons, but because there was a free vote held in both the Commons and the Senate, it ended up dying in the Senate. So because of the pro-life activists, there's basically no law whatsoever in Canada that has anything to say about abortion or whatever. And now it's become almost, no political party, no politician wants to touch it at all. So that's an example in which an effort to try to gain justice did not appreciate the systems that were put in place and the need to compromise. And compromise is part of the political process. If we're going to live with each other, we're going to have to live with people who have different conceptions of justice from what we have. And that means that inevitably, not compromise our principles, but at least compromise in terms of working out concrete policies to address specific issues. That's simply part of the political process.
Other questions?
And to be fair, one more thing, because I think I would rather live in a country where people are compromising rather than to live in a country where the political rulers will say this is the way it's going to be, whether you like it or not. So governments are listening to people. They have to listen. If they don't listen, then that's a reason to it's reason to worry about the kind of system that we're living in.
Again, my bandwidth is low, so if you have a question, feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in.
Hi.
Hi, I have a question. Oh, or Jeff, do you want to go first? Okay. To what degree should we as citizens, and especially as young citizens, be challenging our political system? Like, so if there's something we disagree with, what should we do about that? Like, should we, I think being, like not doing anything doesn't get you anywhere. So how much should we be doing, and how should we do things to challenge our political system?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you have to thoroughly understand the system. Sometimes people say, well, I'm going to write my member of parliament. If a bill has already received first, second reading, it's gone to the report stage, et cetera, then it's almost certainly too late to have an impact on the bill because of party discipline. If your member of parliament is part of the Liberal Party caucus, the governing Liberal Party caucus, and they have to vote with their party. They can't simply vote the way that you want to. So to get involved means that you have to know the way that the system works. Now, in the United States, historically speaking, it was possible to write your congressman, for example, and instruct him or her to vote a particular way. And it's possible that they might listen to you because there was less party discipline historically in the United States, at least during the 20th century, than there is in Canada. So party discipline is very strict in Canada, much stricter than it is in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, you have prime ministers who have to fight off backbench revolts in their own caucus. Never happens in Canada. our system is much more rigid here than it is even in the United Kingdom. So we need to know the system thoroughly. It's better to try to contact maybe a member of cabinet who is responsible for a particular policy area, or even to get involved in lobbying the bureaucracy in some way. And of course, that's going to require a collective effort. So probably means you're going to have to join with your fellow citizens to get involved in some way and to try to be a source of policy advice for governments. And it may be that you may have a royal commission that calls upon interested parties to come before them and to talk to them about a particular policy before the government even thinks about coming up with legislation. So you need to know the system thoroughly before you can get involved, and that's the very first thing. That's what I would advise a young person in particular. So at this stage, you're still learning, and if you don't know the system, if you try to get involved in the way that might seem right, to send an email to your member of parliament, that's not going to help, and it might actually make things worse because you haven't thoroughly understood the way that our system works. Our system works very different than the American system does.
If I could add to that, David, someone once said to me that you can have more of an effect in Canadian politics if you actually become a member of a party than you can almost in being just a voter. And I think there's so, would you say that's true? I have found that there's more opportunity to speak into policy at a membership level in a party than there is as just a citizen who's not a member of a party.
Oh yeah, I think that's true. I have a former student, a recent graduate. I think he's in his mid to late 20s now, whom I still keep in contact with, and he is an activist with one of the federal and the counterpart provincial political party here in Ontario. So and I have no doubt, he may end up going places, and he may have more impact on political life than I ever will, because during my years of teaching, I had to maintain something of a nonpartisan stance. I didn't want to alienate students who might be favorable towards one party or another. I may tend to vote for one party than I would another party, but I've never come out publicly in favor of one party or another. But this former student of mine in his 20s may end up over the long term having more of an impact than academics like I do.
Jeff, you had a question.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
My question was related to the idea of justice, which you've talked about a lot. I was wondering, obviously the idea of justice is very important in government. We have a justice system. From a Christian point of view, maybe the other side of that coin relates to the ideas of love and forgiveness. And I was wondering how you feel those ideas fit into a so-called justice system. Maybe thinking around Jesus's teachings on eye for an eye and that sort of thing. Place for that in actual in the system rather than just person-to-person interaction.
Yeah. Well, let me speak for the English-speaking world here, because we have a system of justice that goes back to the common law. It goes back to King Henry II. This is centuries ago, and at least the 9 English-speaking provinces are heirs to that common law tradition, as are 49 of the American states, with the exception of Louisiana, heir to the common law tradition. Australia, England, not Scotland, incidentally. Scotland has a civil code that's more like Quebec's or Louisiana's, and it has more in common with the continent and the Roman legal tradition. That's one of the things that separates it from England. But at least within the English tradition, to which we are heir, there's always a sense that laws, if they are implemented rigidly, they may inadvertently end up doing injustice. So in addition to the common law courts that were set up centuries ago, there were courts of equity that were set up as well, and these were the first appeals courts, as it were. If you were convinced that you had not been done if you had been done an injustice in the common law courts, you could always go to the courts of equity, and they would hear your case, and they might be able to decide a case in your favor, that might, if not, it wouldn't exactly bend the law, but it would ease the harsh edges of the law. And of course, we have different degrees of murder. If you have plotted a murder and carried it out, you will be punished to the maximum degree. If you have killed somebody, a crime of passion, that's going to be seen as not exactly a lesser offense. I mean, you still murdered somebody, and that needs to be prosecuted, but it's not going to be the same as first degree murder. As a premeditated murder. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, when Israel, the people of Israel moved into the land, there were certain cities of refuge that were set up. There was not a justice system in the way that we know about it. If somebody was murdered, then it was up to the family to avenge that murder. If the person who committed that crime, if it was unintentional, in other words, if it was manslaughter, then they could go to one of these cities of refuge. There were 3 cities of refuge on the near side of the Jordan, 3 cities of refuge on the far side of the Jordan, and they could flee to one of those, and they would be protected against the avenger of blood, who is trying to avenge this death that took place. Some of those principles that we find in the Bible, in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament as well, have become part of our legal traditions in some fashion. Bankruptcy law might be seen as a kind of modern version of the year of Jubilee that was set out in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, so that somebody is there's a limit. There are statutes of limitation that are placed on prosecuting a crime as well. So all of these, mercy, if you will, is always there to temper justice. Now, you might say that our justice system doesn't have enough of that, and maybe that's something to work towards. But again, it's already present in some degree in our positive legal systems, and I think that's something we can thank God for.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
I have a question. It's kind of rambly though. I guess part of it's just like do we simply have to accept injustice to allow for personal freedom and diversity of values within our country?
I think you're going to have to explain what you're getting at with that. It's a little vague still.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
I was thinking specifically more about the issue of abortion.
Okay.
Just because I feel that one's a really gray zone issue right now.
Okay.
And thinking about how a common evangelical stance would be that abortion is morally wrong.
Right.
But
right.
Just because, but that isn't the common stance across Canada. So I was wondering
No.
we can't force necessarily our beliefs onto
Right.
the common, the common people. But then are we just passively allowing what we consider to be an injustice to occur?
Right. I don't think so. I think there's in Canada, it seems as though that issue has been more or less indefinitely pushed to the sidelines because no political figures want to touch it at all, and in that kind of a context, I think what we have to do is to try to raise awareness on the part of people that a child in the womb is a real child. Our daughter was born almost 22 years ago. She was born 14 weeks premature, which is very premature indeed. A normal term is about 40 weeks. She was born at 26 weeks. So she was at McMaster University Medical Center here in Hamilton, and she was there. Then they transferred her to St. Joe's after she was out of danger. And the one thing that struck me is that from the very beginning, even when she should have been in the womb, she was smiling when she was contented. And it was just a very brief little smile, and it wasn't a broad smile. It's not the kind of thing that you associate with a baby who's maybe a few months old. It wasn't like that. It wasn't laughter. It's just that when she was content and we were holding her, then a little smile would briefly come to her face, and that convinced me that babies must smile in the womb. And indeed, a few years later, there was a British study that determined that they did. Once that they have what is it, ultrasound, very detailed ultrasounds that proved something that we suspected already after our daughter was born. And it is, but I think as Christians, even if we're pro-life, we would probably have to settle for a compromised position. Probably at a certain number of weeks, if you will. European countries, far more secularized than Canada and the United States, already have limits on abortion. And I think they look across the pond to us on this side and they say, no limits whatsoever. And they're just aghast that there are no restrictions on abortion whatsoever in a country like Canada. So, but this is something where the time to come up with a compromise measure it's probably past. It was 30 years ago in the past. Maybe something will happen again to change the hearts and minds of Canadians. But I think at this point, that's what we have to do. Try to change the hearts and minds of Canadians. Maybe even more than trying to pursue concrete policy alternatives.
Any final questions? Okay, so we got another one in on the chat box. In answering the earlier question, you refer to the themes found in the Bible around the preferential option for the poor. While there is no perfect system, wouldn't you say that some political structures and views better prioritize and accommodate for the needs of vulnerable groups? Because I wonder, wouldn't liberalism/conservatism always lose out to socialism if Christians sought to prioritize the needs of vulnerable groups?
Yeah, well, a lot of people a lot of Christians make that decision. It's because the Bible is so clear about protecting the poor, protecting the vulnerable. Then we have to become socialists and join socialist parties. And there are many people that have made that move. I would my own judgment is that I don't think that's a necessary move. As a matter of fact, I think that may be a move that will be counterproductive over the long term. Communal ownership of property is a good thing. We already have communal ownership of property. Socialists generally try to take all those different communities and to try to fold them into one community, and I think that's where we're going to see individual rights trampled upon as well. So typically, many socialists are not as concerned about individual rights as they are with communal solidarity. But there's a danger in any kind of communal solidarity that the needs of individuals and other kinds of communities will be overlooked. And I think that's the danger with socialism. But in everything we do, it's people who say, there are certain groups within, maybe small c conservative parties that are effectively social Darwinists and say, well, let the poor fend for themselves. No welfare state, no nothing, and let the poor fend for themselves. Well, I don't think that's a Christian option either. I think there's a good solid reason why we have welfare state programs that are in place. Employment insurance is called now. Universal health care. I know of people in the States who have been bankrupted because of a lengthy hospital stay. With our daughter in hospital right after she was born for 10.5 weeks, if this had happened in the States, I have no doubt that we would be in hock for quite a bit. Our insurance company, private insurance, might have paid some of that. How much, I don't know, but we might have been stuck with a debt that would be almost as large as our mortgage. I wouldn't want to live in that kind of a society. I think there are good reasons why countries like Canada have implemented the sorts of programs they have, so that it's far less likely that people would fall through the cracks in a country that has fewer such programs. But you don't have to be a socialist to make that sort of confession. I'd rather live in the state in Canada right now than in the States, but that doesn't make me a socialist. Nevertheless, I'm willing to admit that it was a socialist by the name of Tommy Douglas, the old Cooperative Commonwealth Federation after 1961, the New Democratic Party, that pushed for the implementation of universal health care. And I think that was a worthy achievement. I think it was a tremendous achievement, and I think we have every reason to be thankful for that here in Canada.
If I may follow up. Is that to say that a best kind of government, if such a thing is possible, would probably be some combination of the five?
Well, I don't think I'm going to use that kind of language, because it suggests that if you simply take different idols from different from different from different ways of worshiping, that somehow it's going to all add up to God, and I don't think it works quite that way. But I think what I would say is that the genuine truths that these ideologies have understood, I think they're worth they're worth being thankful for. So in just the same way that you have ancient peoples like the Philistines and the Canaanites and the Phoenicians and everything worshiping gods, Dagon and Baal and so forth, that were made out of stone and wood. The fact that they were worshiping those gods doesn't mean that there's something wrong with stone and wood. So yeah, stone. We build our houses out of stone. We make maybe thick fences, walls out of stones, and things like that, but we don't worship them. So each of the ideologies has genuinely seen something that's genuinely true, and I think that we have something to learn from the perpetrators of these various ideologies. Even if at a spiritual root level, we would say no.
We're coming up on 10 after 7, and so I do want to be honorable of people's times. Maybe if I could just finish with, kind of a takeaway that you could possibly offer. Are there books that you would suggest that would be very helpful for students to read, that would encourage a deeper engagement or foundation in Christian engagement with public life?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you, there's one book written by a Christian, a man by the name of James Skillen, whom I've known for over 40 years. And he wrote a book several years ago called The Good of Politics. The Good of Politics. I can type it up here if you'd like here. So.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the book. My only critique of The Good of Politics is it tends to be very American in its.
Well, it is. That's right. Yeah, it's quite true. Yeah. Yeah, and I've tried to make my book more international. There are American, but there are also some Canadian and perhaps some European, Brazilian as well, because my book was translated into Portuguese, and it's made quite an impact amongst Christians in Brazil as well. There's another book that was published last year or the year before by Patrick Deneen called "Why Liberalism Failed." A brilliant book. In many respects, I think his analysis of liberalism is very close indeed to my own. Let me just write that here too. And then there's a third book. It's not written by a Christian, but this is something that I had my students reading during the years that I was teaching. As a man by the name of Bernard Crick. In Defense of Politics. It was written in 1962. Bernard Crick, he became Sir Bernard Crick in his last years. He was knighted by the Queen, and it's a very good discussion of politics and the messy nature of politics, and why various ideologies get impatient with the very messiness of politics and try to iron that out in a way that is fundamentally anti-political. So those three books, I think, you can't go wrong by starting with those books. And if you want to contact me privately, I'm always on Facebook. I'm fairly easy to find. I can give you more advice, and I may be able to tailor them to your particular interests and needs.
Thank you for that. Dr. Koyzis, David, thank you very much for your time tonight. It's such an important topic that we often see a lot surface-wise in the news and the media, but we often don't think about the foundations of what's behind the stories that we're commenting on. And so I thank you for taking the time to help us ponder a little bit about the foundations of the political ideologies that we often buy into or participate in, sometimes without even realizing it. And
you're very welcome. I'm really happy to be here. My one regret is that I couldn't actually share a room and a meal with all of you. So maybe once the pandemic ends, then we can start having in-person gatherings again.
Well, that's my regret too. I wish we could do in-person meals too. I'm just going to stop the recording at this point, but then I'm just going to have a couple more words for everybody.